Hi, I'm Tanya Selak. I'm an anaesthetist from Australia. Welcome to everyone listening around the world, either via podcast or video broadcast. Today we are discussing 3 papers from a special anaesthesia issue on sustainable healthcare and the anaesthetist. We have 3 incredibly impressive people here today who have made major contributions to protecting our planet and are authors on 3 of the papers in this very special issue. Unusually for an anaesthesia journal, we have no anaesthetists on the panel. Instead, we have the great privilege of hearing perspectives from a climate scientist, a surgeon, and a pharmacist. Dame Julia Slingo, Miss Virginia Ledder, Ms. Alefia Chikira.
Hello, I'm Julia Slingo. I'm a scientist. I've spent my career in meteorology, climate science, and in particular, modeling the climate system to make predictions and projections of climate change. I've been a university professor, a research director, and I finished my career as chief scientist of the UK's Meteorological Office, a hugely important role where I was in charge of 500 scientists working on everything from forecasting the weather a few hours ahead to long-term climate change.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. I'm Virginia Ledder. I'm a PhD fellow at the NIHR Global Surgery Unit at the University of Birmingham. And I'm actually a general surgery trainee in Merseyside, specializing in colorectal surgery.
Great. Yeah, I'm actually a pharmacist by training. So I trained in Australia, but found myself in the UK around 95 and obviously met a Brit and stayed, which is great. My background's mixed. So whilst I trained in clinical pharmacy, I ended up working in global health for some time, sort of looking at health inequalities and health systems. So that's really my area of interest. And I returned to clinical practice only 7 years ago, and where my skills were sort of utilized in sort of looking at health systems again. And this is how I've arrived. So I'm now with Scottish Government as the head of pharmaceutical sustainability, working in their health infrastructure team.
Thank you so much, the 3 of you. Our listeners will be totally impressed with the breadth of expertise the 3 of you bring. So thank you all so much for making time to speak with us. So let's start to talk about the papers that are in the issue. So let's start with you, Dame Julia. I read your paper today, and I think you've done a really wonderful job of trying to sort of explain to the layperson this idea of volatile anaesthesia, global warming potential, but what that actually means in the living, breathing climate. Why do you think we've sort of held on to this relatively simple concept of GWP rather than sort of moving forward to the things about, radiative forcing?
Well, I mean, it's the first thing to say, it's simple. And it's simple in that all it looks at is the ability of a greenhouse gas to trap thermal infrared radiation in our climate system. And we know carbon dioxide, of course, is the key gas that we worry about. And that's all it is. And when you just look at that, you see a number that's very large for anesthetic gases, and particularly desflurane, which is what we're really talking about today. But unfortunately, GWP was not designed for the purposes, for the uses that it has been taken up in the last decade or so, across all sectors, actually, not just the health sector. It is a very theoretical metric. It tells you nothing about the complexity of the climate system. It's really only valid for gases that are long-lived, like carbon dioxide, which stays in the atmosphere for at least 100 years. And that's the reason why, in fact, we have climate change today, because carbon dioxide has been accumulating ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So there are 3 issues for GWP when we look at the question of, does desflurane cause climate change? Because that's the fundamental, and therefore should we remove it from practice? The 3 issues are that actually GWP, of course, just compares 2 gases radiatively, and it's not taking account of how much of the gas is in the atmosphere. because it's the abundance of the gas that determines the radiative forcing or the energy imbalance that's exerted on the climate system, which causes it eventually to warm. And when you look at the abundance of desflurane in the atmosphere, it is absolutely minute. So despite the fact that the GWP is 2,500 times stronger, bigger than carbon dioxide, there's only 0.37 parts per trillion in the atmosphere compared with 420 million parts per trillion of carbon dioxide. So that's the first point. There's very, very little of desflurane in the atmosphere. The second thing is that if you then go on and say, well, what's the radiative forcing of that 0.37 parts per trillion? You can go back and say, well, I'll take the efficiency, the radiative efficiency of the gas, which is in the GWP metric, and multiply it by the amount of gas in the atmosphere. And then you get a radiative forcing, which is 0.0017 watts per meter squared. Very, very small, eye-wateringly small, really, against 2.16 watts per meter squared for carbon dioxide. And for a climate scientist like me, who knows about all the energy flows around the climate system, you just say this is completely and utterly irrelevant. The other factor that leads us on, I think, then to the next part of the process is the lifetime of the gas. And the crucial thing about desflurane is that its lifetime is short. And there's now been a huge amount of literature in the climate science community about that GWP is invalid for short-lived greenhouse gases like desflurane, and that you can create other metrics, but all of them compromise that climate complexity. And one of the basic problems is the enormous inertia of the climate system to respond to a forcing, in this case, radiative forcing. It takes decades for the system to respond to carbon dioxide because we have these oceans, this massive body of water whose thermal inertia is huge. So climate change works on multi-decadal timescales. And desflurane is gone from the system in 14 years when you emit it. So you've got two things. You've got very small abundance, you've got a short lifetime, and everything about it within the complexity of the climate system makes it therefore vanishingly small and irrelevant. And therefore there's no case, I think, for desflurane, for the arguments that desflurane affects the climate and therefore should be banned. And the final step in this argument is, of course, that if you know the GWP, you can say, what's the equivalent emission of carbon dioxide? And that assumes that GWP is valid for a short-lived climate forcer. And as I've said, that's not true. An alternative is something we call global temperature potential, which tries to take account of the thermal inertia of the climate system that I've talked about. And when you look at GTP, which is also quoted often alongside GWP, you will find that it's about 20% of the GWP. So in other words, we've overestimated the equivalent carbon dioxide from our desflurane emissions by at least 80%. And so every way you look at this problem, you see that actually there is no case to be made to ban desflurane on environmental grounds.
Thank you, Dame Julia. That's a really, it's complex science, and certainly
indeed.
that's all explained more fully in the paper. So we're told we should use TIVA, intravenous anesthesia, rather than desflurane for the climate. And I'm guessing you would argue that for the climate, that is not a valid reason.
That's correct. That's because those arguments are based on this calculation of equivalence CO2 emissions based on GWP. And as I've said, they're an overestimate by at least 80%. If you wanted to use an alternative metric, you should at least use GTP, which would give you equivalent carbon footprint, which is 20% of what's in the published estimates of the carbon footprint of TIVA versus anaesthetic gases. And then I think you would find that actually TIVA was not desirable as a replacement. It has its role, of course, in the different technologies that anaesthetists can use of their choice. But the climate change issue is not a reason to change to TIVA. The carbon footprint is probably, I haven't done the calculations because I don't have access to the data. My estimate is that you would find that the carbon footprint was higher from the waste associated with the production of plastics, and the waste disposal is higher for TIVA than it is from the emissions of desflurane.
So it sounds like we've got more work to do in this area. And I think a lot of anaesthetists who are really passionate about the climate, have tried really hard to move things along, find this message really challenging to hear. But it's so important, isn't it, that we just keep our minds nice and open and just keep following that science. So let's move on to Virginia's paper. So you did this incredible paper where you tried to work out how could we get surgeons and surgical teams to have greener surgery. So really kind of at the beginning of its journey. Can you tell us about the challenges of writing this article in terms of getting evidence to base green surgery initiatives on?
Yes, thank you. So as you said, we are really at the beginning of the journey when we think about sustainability in surgery. It has become like topical fields in the last few years, but looking at evidence to kind of put in the paper or inform the paper, it was quite hard. The evidence is immature. There is not enough out there. So that was definitely a challenge. And also when we look at the studies that have been made, because a lot has been published recently, it mostly seemed to be from kind of single center enthusiasts. So there is interventions that have been applied to one hospital, but not necessarily those interventions that seem to work there will work in other centers. Or, for example, most of the evidence comes from high-income countries. So how can we generalize that to low-income countries, which probably have a very different supply chain and way of operating in an operating theatre? So it is very difficult to write a paper that has kind of advice on what surgical teams should do when the evidence is such an early stages. So that was definitely kind of a complication for it. Also, because all the studies report their findings in different ways, so there is no standardized reporting when we think about benefit with regards to carbon impact for intervention. So everyone is looking at slightly different kind of boundaries for the intervention that they've implemented, and everyone is looking at slightly different outcomes. So how do we put them all together in a way that we can give advice that is valid and generalizable for other centers that want to go on this sustainability journey? So that's definitely another challenge. Like the practicalities of how to advise surgical team to implement the intervention within their own team, like how to technically do it. And then another challenge is that the fact that we have seen centers implementing interventions. Some of them have been successful. However, can these interventions be realistically sustained through times? Because as you mentioned earlier, there is, winter pressures, there is, strikes, there is so different complications. And how can we actually maintain that intervention through time? That is definitely something that not a lot of studies can show. So how can we inform, different surgical teams globally that they should do this, and how can they do this for a prolonged period of time?
So Virginia, what do you think is what are the key messages from your paper?
In terms of the interventions that we present, it's adopting those that are easily implementable by the frontline team. So reducing, for example, the amount of instruments in the surgical trays, or avoid opening all the kits straight away. So simple things that, anyone can do that don't need a lot of stakeholder engagement, that can be done straight away and can be done daily, easily, and that would have a great effect. Also engage with research. So that is really the best way of getting that evidence, that strong evidence that we need. Engage in research projects, engage in collaborative projects, because only that way we're going to get that strong kind of evidence that is required. And also, I would say, engage with the rest of the team, because as you said, you know, here we have such a variety, just today, such a variety of professionals. So engage with your colleagues, see what's going on in the rest of the hospital, just because it is, you know, it is really a team effort. We can't really do it alone. And for that reason, also try and, you know, upskill yourself, learn about carbon literacy, learn about behavioral change, because those are two aspects. Those are two kind of cross-cutting bits of knowledge that you can really bring with you that will allow you to ensure that the intervention can be perhaps more sustained through times, and also brought forward and widened to the wider hospital environment rather than just within the operating theatres.
Great work. It is, and you know, it's all teams, and it's all behavior change, isn't it? It's just fascinating, quite sort of simple concepts, but very difficult to achieve.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So Alafia, I wonder if we could turn our attention to your paper now. This nitrous oxide project is fascinating and so impactful when I look at the numbers that you've managed to achieve. I'm wondering how you got started with that. You're a pharmacist. You're asking anaesthetists to change the way they work. Did you face any barriers? How did you get started? I'm really interested in the backstory.
Yeah, so what happened is I joined NHS Lothian as their sort of lead for theatres and anaesthetics. Obviously, the main concern is obviously, can you save me some money? Right, that's the first question. You know, like we need to save money, and I mean, this is the thing working in a public health system. Sustainability isn't just environmental sustainability, and it's not just carbon emissions, is it? So. And we'll come back to the TIVA point. I agree, but for different reasons on the TIVA point, but I think all valid. So it's about sustainability across a number of dimensions, including managing risk, including fiscal viability over a long period of time, as well as managing our environmental risks. We have very high emission in the West, at least. There are many health services that deliver very good healthcare for low emissions. So I think there's a lot to learn across countries. So I'm digressing a bit. So you asked me a question, I'll get back to it. So the irony is that I noticed I was interested in sort of understanding their anesthetic footprint. It seemed like the low-hanging fruit. Although it really wasn't. Actually, when I came to the nitrous oxide, I realized there was a problem. But the irony was, it was the desflurane, the depreciation or the reduction of desflurane that drew my attention to saying, why is the nitrous oxide not decreasing? And then I started interviewing anaesthetists. So this I sort of embedded into my dissertation. I was doing a master's in public health, and but I started interviewing and doing the sort of that 5-wire childlike questioning, and they were like, "Oh, I'm using a lot of it." And then when you actually sort of dig down, they were using teaspoons, right? So they were they just kind of were just almost panicking about their use when there was no need to panic, So and it really boiled down to very narrow areas of clinical use: induction at pediatrics, which they run it for a couple of minutes. Obs and gynae, emergency cases, and maybe the odd colorectal case. So very, very low use. You get some traditional anaesthetists who just use it as their staple, but actually don't really need it, and actually find they're using too many antiemetics when they're giving it. So actually have changed their practice because they found their patients are less sick if they give less nitrous. So this was all very interesting. So what I saw was a trend in nitrous oxide diminishing in use. It was a drug that was really favored, when we were using halothane. So I was asking all these questions. I was being very annoying. And I proposed a hypothesis in my dissertation, which was probably outside the scope of my dissertation, but, time is money. We've got to keep moving. And I was able to do a test of change. And at one site, we were losing, actually, I reassessed it again. We were losing basically all our nitrous oxide. We were losing all of it. So initially sort of put the prediction at around 90%, but it was actually all of it. So that was 792,000 litres, which isn't just emissions going into the environment. That's an insult to your portering staff who are having to move these big barreling cylinders, and there's occupational health risk. it's possibly a leak that's not being picked up by the ventilation. Maybe it's because it might be at an area where it's a corridor valve, you know, so some passerby is constantly, who's, you know, a porter and stuff. It's always the band 2s, the band 3s, the lowest paid getting the hyper exposure, whereas your clinical staff are all protected because they've got great ventilation, right? So there's a little bit of a cheek to all of this. And I realized there's a little bit of underinvestment in planned preventative maintenance, infrastructure. And the irony was, it was the desflurane, you know, the declining use that drew my attention. But also then I quickly realized that there were data gaps. So the way we use nitrous oxide was the problem. Nitrous oxide, there's many stakeholders involved, and that was half the problem. So pharmacy doesn't actually gain sight of this. It's remotely received, it's remotely installed. There's many players involved in supply and maintenance of nitrous oxide. And then there's also this underinvestment in that supply. So the underinvestment in training, the underinvestment in making sure there is enough of these staff on the ground to look after these systems, and underappreciation of planned preventative maintenance by clinical staff themselves. So like allowing the opportunity to go into theatres. That's all changed now, I think, with the nitrous oxide project. You know, I think and also with COVID. So that happened. I was able to do the analysis, able to improve the data streams that were coming in. I realized I needed to get the medical supplier data, but then also delineating a way we can do this. One of the key themes, I said, well, anaesthetists, you need to articulate your clinical use. I don't mean hazard a guess. I mean actually quantify it. Because they would go, yeah, I use loads. And I go, well, prove it, right? So so that was a bit challenging, to be honest with you. I think they were kind of a little bit shirky that I was asking, but then I think they realized after I proved on the first site, because it was I spotted straight away that was lost, because they didn't have a maternity unit, they didn't have pediatrics. Why were they going through so much nitrous oxide? So it was kind of like I went there first because I knew it would be an easy win, and once I proved that, I could prove it across the other sites very quickly. So so that was essentially it.
Amazing. So it's almost like desflurane was the canary, hey, that led you to the nitrous.
But it's going back to Virginia's point on behaviours. So I think that was for me. I mean, I take a health economics perspective as well. So for me, as a pharmacist, I was quite keen for them to stop using desflurane, because it was, in practical terms, it was 4 times more expensive. My view is that you need to have a blend or a mix of anesthetic tools available, and Tiva is one, but it's not the only one. And you wouldn't ever want to get rid of volatile, at least until something amazing comes along that's so amazing. You know, we've got to keep our minds open, because what you want to keep that a mix of tools available, because as soon as you sacrifice one, you risk the opportunities of care that you're giving your patients. You may not have an opportunity to get a line in, and you do need the gas. So I think that's really important. And Tiva, I also have concerns around Tiva around ecotoxicity. And that's something, and I mean, I know that's not Julia's area, but it's an area that I'm interested in, and it's an area that's poorly understood. And I think cautionary principles do apply. So I know you're asking a message, but the clear message is don't be wasteful. And nitrous oxide has been an exemplar of waste and poor care and poor investment in infrastructure. So I'll come back to that later. Sorry, carry on. Sorry, ask another question.
I think that point that you make about not sort of banning something, and then that whole area of therapeutics is now not available for your patients. And I think a lot of the anaesthetists who have been really cranky about ban the DES have been really annoyed, because they feel imposed upon, and in their clinical environment, they need the nitrous to help induce a pediatric. Or they have patients with no veins and they have to do a gas induction. And they find that they're really being pushed and pulled around. And sort of they're worried that life cycle analysis of propofol hasn't entirely been done. And yet we say that this is one thing's great and one thing's no good.
Yeah, so I think just to bear in mind, so we move through drugs. So there's many volatiles out there. I'm old enough to remember halothane, all right? And you ask 10 anaesthetists, you ask you ask 10 anaesthetists their opinions, you'll get 11 answers. Okay, so let's keep that in mind. So I'm not attached to desflurane, okay, romantically or anything. I haven't got any strong passion about it as an agent. I know I'll see a lot of hyperbole from my anaesthetists. I honestly ignore it because I think we just need a straightforward HTA assessment of any drugs. They just strip away your emotions, and I'm not convinced of desflurane as an agent. There was a lot of campaigning around it, so that's a separate argument. But I do like, I'm partial to, I'm a pharmacist. I'm partial towards SIBO and ISO. It's cheaper, and I've got other systems I need to maintain and other drugs I need to get plump out. But at the same time, I'm concerned, like sugar Gamodex has a huge toxicity, huge environmental, but it's a really great drug, right? It's when you want to do reversal over neostigmine, it is the drug you want to go for. You've got an obese patient, you've got a problem, you want to grab that sugar Gamodex and you want to get it in there, but it has a huge ecotoxic profile. I haven't gone and say ban sugar Gamodex, have I? I have not said that, but I think we need to have those conversations, and they're really uncomfortable, and we need to have them. So, it's a really expensive drug. So I could say, oh, I don't want you to use it, but actually, no, I want you to get that patient up and out. I don't want him to go to ICU. I want him up and out, right? So I think it's just about measuring it. But, desflurane for me as a pharmacist, you can't convince me that it's better than SIBO and ISO. You can't convince me. But we'll see. But we'll take that away. We'll give it to the HTA and see what they have to say about that,
Wonderful. Thank you so much, all three of you, for this wonderful chat. Very quickly, I'm going to put each of you on the spot. I'm an anaesthetist going to work now. What do you want me? Give me one thing I can do to help the planet. Dame Julia, go. One thing.
Maybe walk, ride, or take public transport.
Come on!
And I could also add, think about where in your hospital you could plant a tree.
Okay, walk, plant a tree. Great. Virginia.
I would say engage in research. I think there's still a lot that we don't know. So I think the best thing that we can do is engage in research and find out what is really the most sustainable thing to do.
Knowledge is power. Alafia, what's one thing I can do today when I get on my way to work to help the planet? Tell me.
I think the most important thing is to stay calm. I know that sounds really, really difficult in this day and age. And remember that when you go to work in a hospital, you're really part of a complex, I think the most complex social enterprise you can imagine, right? And if there are changes you want to make, start talking to people, start understanding who they are, what their pressures are, what makes them exhausted to come in. And really, I think for me, active travel, as Julia mentioned, should really service the most vulnerable in your hospital. So think about, why are they not catching? Why are they not riding a bike? So you'll be a classic. The person riding a bike will be a bloke, a consultant. He's not scared of the traffic. He's not scared of being knocked over. He's not scared, right? So you need to work out what those fears are for the more vulnerable members of your cohort. And that's not necessarily a surgical team or you're an anesthetic team. It could be the band 2, band 3 woman who's going off to pick up 3 kids. So you need to think about those, and they actually make up the bulk of your females, and lower paid staff make the bulk of the hospital. So think about your community as a whole. I know that's a big ask, but and I know it's easy to sort of just hold on tight, but there's a lot of people who work in a hospital, and they need your attention.
So I'm walking to work, I'm planting a tree when I get there, I'm engaging in research, and I'm keeping calm, and I'm thinking about everyone in my workplace. So we're going to leave that there. Thank you so much. I could talk with you 3 beautiful humans all day. For everyone listening, that's just been fascinating. You can read all of these 3 papers. They're free to download, free forever, and all of the rest of the papers in the special environment edition of Anesthesia Journal. Thank you so much.